Fukushima power plant disaster. The power of atoms released by earthquake. On March 11, 2011, the Japanese islands were struck by an earthquake of enormous force. For 6 minutes, the ground was shaking, turning whole towns into piles of rubble. But while the struggle to recover from the most powerful earthquake in the history of Japan was going on, no one was aware that the earthquake was the prelude to yet another drama. At the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, a disaster of unprecedented proportions was about to happen. Welcome to Dark History, where we unravel the most disastrous events in history. If you want to support the channel, consider subscribing and like this video. The magnitude 9.1 undersea megathrust earthquake was not the only disaster that struck the northeastern coast of Honshu Island that day. Around half an hour after the earthquake, a tsunami hit the coast. It was actually this giant wave that brought more devastation than the earthquake. More than 200 square miles of ground were flooded, taking away thousands of lives and causing damage worth hundreds of billions of dollars. At the town of Okuma, in the Fukushima prefecture, the tsunami flooded the nuclear power plant, cutting off the power supply to a system responsible for cooling down the nuclear reactors. With no means to reduce it, the temperature of the reactors increased and eventually caused explosions in 4 reactors. The amount of radiation released into the atmosphere made the Fukushima power plant disaster the second most infamous nuclear incident in the history of the world. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake was the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan. The epicenter of the magnitude 9.1 thrust was in the northwestern Pacific Ocean, 45 miles east of Oshika Peninsula on Honshu Island, the largest of 4 Japanese main islands. The earthquake was felt throughout the entire country, but the most powerful vibrations were recorded in the prefectures of Miyagi, Fukushima, Ibaraki, and Toshiji. Thrust was so powerful that it moved the island of Honshu 8 feet east and shifted the Earth on its axis by 10 inches, increasing its rotational speed by 1.8 milliseconds per day. Even though the Japanese had never witnessed an earthquake of such an enormous force, they knew how to behave in such situations. After all, Japan is the country with the most earthquakes in the world. One thing the Japanese knew for sure: when a strong earthquake strikes, it is always accompanied by a tsunami. Tsunamis are waves produced by undersea earthquakes. Once the waves approach the coast and the shallow waters, they turn into giant waves. The March 11th earthquake was expected to produce a tsunami as high as 130 feet in certain regions. The first and the most powerful earthquake that day occurred at 1446. It lasted for 6 whole minutes, causing severe damage to infrastructure in the most affected regions. As soon as the ground stopped trembling, a tsunami warning was issued. Only a couple of minutes was given to citizens in the coastal areas to leave their homes and run to higher grounds. Indeed, about half an hour later, a mighty tsunami hit the northeastern coast of Honshu Island. Not even 18 feet high seawalls were enough to stop the giant wave. Whole towns were engulfed by the seawater, taking everything in its way. Compared to the damage inflicted by the tsunami, the earthquake was just a minor disturbance. In the 4 prefectures most affected by the earthquake and tsunami, there were 4 nuclear power plants with 11 reactors operating at the moment. One of them was TEPCO's 6 reactors Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in the coastal town of Okuma. Only reactors 1, 2, and 3 were operational when the earthquake occurred. As soon as the ground started trembling, they automatically shut down and stopped producing energy. The design of reactors in the entire power plant was robust enough to withstand earthquakes even of such tremendous scale. However, the damage was inflicted to all 6 external power supply sources providing electricity to pumps needed for cooling down the reactor's cores. Even though the reactors stopped working, the cores continued to heat up due to the decay heat produced by the radioactive nuclear fuel after the fission has ceased. As a result, each reactor was equipped with a pump that circulated water through reactor cores to cool it down. When these pumps were cut off from the external power supply sources, emergency diesel generators automatically took over the cooling of the reactors. Everything appeared to be in perfect order, but then the tsunami came. At 1542, the first 45 feet high wave hit the Daiichi power plant located on the very coast. It was followed by another one 8 minutes later. The power plant's 30-foot high seawalls proved inadequate protection in this situation, and the water broke into the power plant. The diesel generators located in the basement of the turbine buildings were flooded and stopped working. The whole power plant went into a blackout. More importantly, the reactor cooling system stopped working. The situation caused serious concern in the plant, where an immediate evacuation of the staff was ordered. The plant management informed the Fukushima prefecture authorities about the problem, and at around 1903, a nuclear emergency was declared. At 2050, an evacuation order was issued for all people within a radius of 2 kilometers from the plant. Half an hour later, as the news of the situation in the plant reached the government in Tokyo, the radius was extended to 3 kilometers. With standard pumps unpowered and diesel generators flooded, the plant staff that remained on the site began injecting water into the system via an emergency core cooling system. But unfortunately, their effort to connect the plant to the external power system was fruitless. With the cooling system out of order, the temperature of the fuel rods inside the reactor pressure vessel began to rise, producing a lot of steam pressure. The pressure was reduced by venting it to the suppression pond wet well, specially designed for this purpose. This led, however, to the decrease of water level inside the vessel with fuel rods. 3 hours after the earthquake, the water level in Reactor 1 dropped below the top of the fuel rods. 1.5 hours later, the water level was already at the bottom of the fuel rods. As the temperature of fuel rods increased to 2800 degrees Celsius, they began to melt. With fuel rods exposed, their hot zirconium cladding came in contact with the steam, producing an enormous amount of hydrogen. The presence of hydrogen itself was not the problem. However, its mixture with oxygen, either pure or in the air, is highly explosive. As the plant staff attempted to relieve the pressure inside the reactor pressure vessel, the hydrogen was accidentally released into the surface floor at the top of the reactor building. On March 12th, at 1536, the mixture of hydrogen and air ignited and caused a massive hydrogen explosion that blew off the roof of the reactor building. A similar scenario was going on in reactors 2 and 3 with a certain delay. However, the backup water injection system in these units was powered by batteries and was in operation longer. The system collapsed in Reactor 3 on March 12th, while in Reactor 2, it went down on March 14th. At 1100 hours on March 14th, a hydrogen explosion blew off the roof and the top part of the building of Reactor number 3. Due to the joint piping system, some of the hydrogen leaked to Reactor 4, causing the same type of explosion early in the morning of March 15th. Inside Reactor 2, there was no explosion on the surface floor. To prevent explosions like those in Reactors 1 and 3, the staff opened the blowout panel on top of the building to vent out the hydrogen. Even though they prevented an explosion, their maneuver led to increased emission of radioactive gases outside the reactor building. The process of venting out the pressure was not the only source of radioactive pollution. It is estimated that most radioactivity was emitted from Reactor 2, where the meltdown of the nuclear fuel and an explosion in the primary containment dry well caused a rupture in the reactor walls, allowing the polluted water to leak out. Among fission products released into the air and sea were iodine-131, cesium-137, and cesium-134. Iodine-131 is a volatile radioisotope with a very short half-life of only 8 days. Cesium-137, however, has a half-life of more than 30 years, and exposure to large amounts of it can cause severe sickness and even death. Aware of the dangers caused by the meltdown of nuclear fuel, already on March 12th, the authorities ordered the evacuation of everyone within a 12-mile radius from the plant. Radioactive releases spread quickly. Already on March 12th, the day when the first explosion occurred, increased radiation was detected at a station 120 miles away. 2 weeks later, radioactivity was detected in measuring stations across the northern hemisphere. The lucky circumstance was that the amount of radioactivity turned out to be below the level that could seriously threaten people's lives and health. The emission of radioactivity was 10 times smaller than at Chernobyl. the worst nuclear disaster in the history of the world. A more controversial issue was the release of contaminated water into the ocean. To obtain more storage for highly contaminated water, and with the government's permission, plant staff released 10,400 cubic meters of contaminated water to the sea in early April. In addition, an unknown amount of the contaminated water from Reactor 2 had leaked through the ground. Unlike Chernobyl, the Fukushima nuclear incident resulted in no direct casualties. However, 154,000 people were evacuated from the area around the plant. It was a huge shock to leave homes and everything they had to most of them. It is estimated that most of more than 2,000 disaster-related deaths were caused not by radioactivity exposure but by stress caused by the evacuation and living in shelters. Still, life changed for good for those who lived within the 143 square miles red zone. Even in 2021, this zone remains evacuated. The March 2011 events were a disaster of enormous proportions. The forces of nature were relentless and unstoppable. What happened at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant seemed like an unfortunate outcome of a natural disaster that could not be prevented. However, the truth was quite different. The Independent Investigation Commission, set up by the National Parliament, determined that the plant power, Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, had failed to meet the safety requirements in case of natural disasters and completely ignored the tsunami risk assessments based on the latest researches. TEPCO management failed to improve a number of features that would have prevented the disaster, starting from low sea barriers over inadequate cooling systems to unclear instructions given to employees in case of an incident. The company management was accused of negligence to maintain the myth of absolute safety of nuclear power. If the risks were publicly acknowledged, the management feared the public would demand the plants to shut down. Therefore, any kind of preparation in case of nuclear incidents was not allowed in order not to disturb the public. A part of the blame was also on the government, which failed to force the nuclear power plants to implement adequate safety measures. Paradoxically, the nuclear safety regulatory regime that was supposed to do the job was under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, one of the fiercest promoters of nuclear energy. 12 days after the earthquake, reactors at the Fukushima nuclear power plant were connected to external power sources, and the cooling of reactors 1 to 3 was re-established. On August 10th, work began on building covers over the reactors to prevent further emission of radioactive particles. At the same time, cleanup crews have already removed much of the radioactive debris from the site. 9 months after the incident, 3 damaged reactors were put into a stable state of cold shutdown. The Fukushima power plant disaster brought significant changes in Japan's energy policy. Public confidence in the safety of nuclear power was greatly damaged. Despite the government's intention to increase the participation of nuclear power plants in overall power production, they were forced to reduce the nation's reliance on nuclear power. Immediately after the Fukushima disaster, all but 2 nuclear reactors in the country were temporarily shut down. The government ordered nuclear risk and safety reassessments and formed a new nuclear regulatory agency within the Environment Ministry to control the work of nuclear power plants. The Fukushima nuclear disaster taught the Japanese and the whole world that the horrifying strength of nuclear power should never be taken for granted. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please like and subscribe. See you next time.